Good morning, everybody, to this second panel of our RECONNECT conference. The RECONNECT conference, which title is, if you followed us in the first panel already, What Future for the European Union? Discussions on the Rule of Law and Democracy in the EU after COVID-19. And I think that this second panel is actually providing us potentially with some answers to the question which we raise in the overall conference, but also since it is bringing in a connect between what can be called the rule of law backsliding, the crisis around rule of law backsliding, and democracy on the other hand. So welcome to this second panel, which is called Re-Estimating Populism's Impact on European Democracy. Rule of law backsliding and the rise of defect democracies have, in fact, become a persistent phenomenon in the EU over the last years, not only in some of the member states in particular, but also since some of the parties which are heavily involved in the making of defect democracies are now represented and have even become more represented in the European Parliament. Until today, EU institutions struggle to find appropriate ways to respond to the erosion of the EU's core values. What actually is the state of democracy in the European Union? That's a question that we want to answer in this panel. In this panel, we will discuss RECONNECT's latest empirical findings on the state of democracy and the rule of law in Europe, and raise the question if European populism is about undermining, or in fact, potentially also about reforming European democracies. And last but not least, we're asking how could the EU respond to the democratic deficit that it is facing and foster greater citizen participation. It's a great pleasure to welcome a very distinguished panel, and people on that panel are in the order of appearance. Professor Ben Crum, Professor of Political Science at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. Professor Peter de Wilde, a Professor of Political Science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. Dr. Alvaro Oleaert, postdoctoral researcher at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And last but obviously not least, and heartfelt welcome to Dr. Rosa Balfour, the director of Carnegie Europe in Brussels. So thank you very much for joining us on this panel, for taking on this daunting task of asking some of the most complicated questions which the European Union faces today. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ben Crum, but also by reminding everybody on the panel to switch off their audios while the others are talking, and the audience to already sharpen their pens to raise questions and comments in, obviously, an online version today. Ben, it's your turn.
Thank you, Kolja. Great to have this conversation today and to be able to test out some ideas, some findings, some preliminary findings of the research that we've been doing in RECONNECT, and also to connect it with actors who are close to the policy making and maybe less in the academic world. I think our starting point in the research that we've been doing in RECONNECT, and in particular on the state of democracy in Europe, is very much that we want to move beyond the question as it was raised like 4 years ago, 2016, with the election of Trump, with Brexit. You suddenly had all these debates about how do democracies die, the end of democracy. And we want to turn it around. How do we keep democracies alive? How can democracies rebound in what are, of course, challenging times? And the way I want to organize my short presentation is very much to say a bit about how we frame that question then, or how we try to reframe that question in the context of RECONNECT, to say a bit about our preliminary findings, and then to conclude a bit on how we could diagnose preliminarily again what has been happening to democracy and what may be the long-term effect of on democracy of the COVID-19 crisis. So those are the steps, the outline of the research, some general findings, and some more specific observations with regards to the COVID-19 crisis impact on democracy. Now, the main challenge, of course, to democracy as it is in Europe is constituted by populist parties. Well, we adopt a rather broad conception of populist parties, where our populist parties, well, commonly they are defined as mobilizing on an anti-establishment sentiment, and also claiming to represent the people that have been left unrepresented by the establishment forces or parties as they are. Now, what I think is striking also is, of course, when you look at populist parties, is that there's inherent ambiguity. On the one hand, they are elected by democratic rules, they play the parliamentary game, but often, of course, you also hear them saying things that can be deemed threatening. And often, of course, people say, well, they may have a hidden agenda. And I think what's really crucial to the way that we want to look at it is to respect that ambiguity. And we actually think that parties are complex actors. They have many different factions. They have many different voices. They are often opportunistic. And to look at the dynamics of how do these parties evolve. And of course, we know of some parties, populist parties, that really have turned out to be a severe threat to democracy. And the easy example is Fidesz in Hungary. But you can also think of populist parties that were labeled populist, but now seem to be rather loyal members of the democratic system, like Podemos now in Spain. So the question is really, how can we estimate the danger of populist parties, but also how can we assess the conditions under which they may be open to be accommodated in the democratic system? Because populist parties, of course, they don't come out of nowhere. They do bring in new forces. They do appeal to certain popular sentiments. So in that sense, we should also draw lessons and try to use them to improve democracy rather than to simply push back on them. And our main concern, where are the main dangers of populist parties? We try to specify in two respects. One is very much about intolerance of the political rights of certain minority groups. So when certain parts of societies are really defined as enemies, and some people who should not be part of the democratic process, like migrants, for instance, but also maybe like LGBT people. That's one major concern where we think they're really biting away at the foundations of democracy. And the other is where they challenge the main constitutions that protect democratic pluralism, like courts, like the freedom of the press, like civil society. And we really want to target those indicators and say, do they really do that? And how do they do that over time? Do they start from a very harsh crackdown rhetoric and then be softened over time? Or indeed, do they radicalize, like Fidesz again did over time, starting out as a rather moderate party, but then finding its enemies? Now, when you look then at the state of Europe, we do have indeed that one example where things have really gone badly, and where we can basically say that democratic pluralism has been abolished, and where it's very hard to see how the sitting government can be voted out. All the conditions of fair and open political competition have been reduced, and that's Hungary. And that's a clear extreme case where populists have dismantled democracy. But elsewhere, of course, we see populist parties giving way reason and cause for concern, but there's a considerable pushback. Democratic systems have turned out to be remarkably resilient, and also forcing populist parties to adjust their strategies, to rethink how they want to position themselves. Now, the resilience of the democratic systems, we try to identify different channels for how does that operate? Where does it come from? And the solutions or the resilience of democratic systems is clearly different in different EU states. So in that sense, there's not one golden solution. It's a mix of factors, and some systems rely more on certain factors and others more on others. So let me just give some illustrations of how democratic systems may indeed illustrate the ability to resist anti-democratic pluralism. And I think what we're also looking at, just one more preliminary remark before I get to the illustrations, is very much we think that many of these strategies need to be calibrated very carefully. It's a balance often between embracing populists and simply hijacking the discourse and becoming populists ourselves on the one hand, and on the other hand, completely ostracizing them and saying that they're unreasonable, and also ostracizing their supporters with that, and indeed the grounds and the discontent on which they mobilize. But finding a balance between indeed full embrace and full ostracizing is critical here. So let me just take some examples. So we look at three main factors. One is the resilience to civil society and media. One is the resilience of the established parties, and one is very much checks in the electoral systems. And one critical case, of course, here is Poland. It's a very topical case. It's a case that we all will be watching very eagerly in the next weeks. 12th of July, second round of the presidential elections. I think it's important to underline that Poland is not Hungary yet. It could become a second Hungary, but now you still see that there's a pushback from particularly from the civil society, that you see a major now running for president. You saw a media figure running for president, that there's still a diverse civil society that can mobilize and engage in the political competition. So that's one example, I think, where you still see that a diverse, pluralist civil society can be a source to push back on the anti-democratic tendencies of the ruling populist party. Another one is very much the interaction between parties. So we looked at Spain, for instance. I mentioned the example before. Alvaro can say much more about it, but I think what's very interesting is that Podemos was often ambiguous between being anti-constitutional, being supportive of the democratic constitution, and in the end, it's also in the interaction between the Social Democratic Party, the PSOE, they've in the end opted for committing themselves to the constitution. And the third factor here, I think, is very much the electoral system. So looking at my own country, the Netherlands, what we have is that actually one way to check populist parties is by allowing new ones to come in. So once people get a bit fed up with the old populist party, there is a new competitor. But you may say, well, this open political system, electoral system, really invites populism, but at the same time, it also invites new challenges and populists to compete among each other. Now, last 2 minutes to conclude. What do we see when we look at the impact of COVID-19? Well, that's, of course, very early days. I think, again, you see, I think, big range of variation. There's no overarching tendency. And of course, again, Hungary stands out. Orban has really used COVID-19 to further clamp down on a civil society and to govern by decree. But again, Poland is slightly different. There, indeed, PIS tried to have presidential elections earlier. They were postponed, and the situation changed, and now they're hanging in the balance, and we have to see. And indeed, it will be a major issue whether Duda will get another term, or whether we will see a more pro-democratic president coming into power, also for Europe at large. If you then look at the rest of Europe, I think the movements are also different. I mean, one is, of course, that established parties have gained confidence initially. There was a rally around the flag effect. I think another thing is that also we see that there's an emerging debate between increased state power, new state capacity, state investments, which looks very much like the old left-right dimension taking front stage again. But then again, populists and Democrats may well mobilize on the fallout of the crisis, certainly if the economy also goes further down. And I think there's of course, there's very interesting cases where you have to look closely what's going to happen there. One, of course, will be Italy. It's bound to be economically come into difficult times. The Lega North is waiting in the wings. Can indeed the sitting government maintain its authority? not only France, because there you've seen the complete dissolution of the old established parties, and now it's basically between Macron and Le Pen. But I think what you miss is actually the old established parties to kind of give some stability here. Belgium is an interesting case, very decentralized response. The question of re-centralization is actually even put on the agenda by COVID-19. And Sweden, of course, has taken its own road, and there it will be very interesting to see what it will have to the support of the established parties, or whether indeed populist opponents will mobilize quite effectively. So that's an open question. But I think what's important here is that there's variation, and that democracy is not lost, and we should not leave democracy to be lost to the populists, but rather look for the range of strategies that can be adopted to make democracy stronger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben Crum, for this first impression on the overall research package, which RECONNECT is trying to grasp here with regards to populism. The question whether populism is a friend or a foe, and the question also to which degree systems, political systems, democracies are able to respond. Are they embracing? Are they showing resilience? And you also alluded to the thin red line, perhaps, between these two. Let's keep it for the debate. And I would also like to ask everybody in the audience, and we are up to 130 participants already again, to ask their questions on these also quite intriguing questions. How embracing do we have to be, so to speak, in European democracies when it comes to populist parties? How can we actually use populism as a way to reform democracy in Europe? Peter de Wilde will give us an overview now of some of the findings in his research and the research of Anna Gura at the University of Trondheim, the Technical University of Norway. And Peter, without asking too much from you, what is then actually the state of democracy in Europe?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kolja. Well, that's a key question that I'd like to discuss briefly with you, based, as you said, on research done together with Anna Gura here, my colleague at NTNU, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. My presentation today is provocatively titled, "We Need an Ethics Commission on the Quality of Deliberation." This, to the insiders, is a play to the existing Venice Commission on Rule of Law, a body under the auspices of the Council of Europe, monitoring the status of rule of law within many European countries, a well-recognized, prestigious, independent body that is closely listened to by many policymakers. Now, what we've seen in the wake of rising populism in Europe is democratic backsliding. What does that mean? It means that existing liberal democracies, member states in the EU, have seen features of authoritarianism without fully going authoritarian. This has basically started in 2010 when Viktor Orban regained power in Hungary, followed by other countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovenia. There are different trends in different countries to different degrees. In the EU, there's a big debate about the extent to which there is a response possible, a response necessary to these developments, and what that should be. I don't want to engage in the debate of whether there is enough of a response by EU actors. Rather, I'd like to draw your attention to what exactly they focus on, and that is particularly rule of law. The EU has institutions that allow some action against deterioration of the rule of law. This is provided in the treaties, and there is expert feedback, expertise available on this. So my argument is, to the extent that the EU has responded to democratic backsliding as a result of populism in Central and Eastern Europe, it has focused on the rule of law. And in my perspective, this is only one component of a complex system of liberal democracy. Let me try to basically provide you a very sketchy overview of this. There are many components to this central system that the EU member states and the EU itself is founded upon. Rule of law is one of them. It's an important one, but it's only just one of them. And there are a range of others that have to do with basic functioning of elections, which we often in political science refer to as polyarchy, and then a range of freedoms and separation of power, but also the limits to the extent to which we can tolerate economic inequality, with the argument that political equality only is feasible if there is if people aren't economically with the backs against the wall, and a strong focus on deliberation, on the existence of a public sphere in which arguments can be exchanged, and that the policy is the result of a process of exchanging arguments, exchanging views. Everybody has a chance to make themselves heard, and the best argument wins. All these different elements of democracy come together in a very extensive data set called the Varieties of Democracy data set that monitors every country in the world, including all EU member states, from a long time ago until the present day, on a whole range of democracy indicators, of which I've just mentioned only a few. They aggregate in 5 basic dimensions, which we, Anagora and I, have analyzed within Central and Eastern European member states after Eastern enlargement, so all countries joining the EU in 2004 and afterwards. And they basically fall into these 5 main categories. The core democratic features of existence of elections and multiple political parties, universal suffrage, then elements of liberalism, including rule of law and separation of powers, participation, whether citizens actually take part in democratic processes and turnout, deliberation, are arguments provided, are there alternative sources of information, do people have a chance to make themselves heard, and do they do so with at least minimum levels of respect for other people that disagree, and economic equality. And what we see here, this is just a little glimpse of the analysis that we've done in one of the RECONNECT deliverables that you see at the bottom line here in the screen, which you could look up online. It's freely available. What we see here is that, especially since about 2012, there is a sharp decline in the quality of deliberation in Central and Eastern European member states, EU member states. There's also a decline in the other indicators of democracy, but it is not as steep as the one in deliberation. So we're drawing your attention that there's more to democracy than just rule of law, and that other elements of democracy might see a stronger decline in the wake of populism than rule of law. Hence, our call for an Athens Commission on the quality of deliberation. The naming of an Athens Commission is, of course, somewhat arbitrary. It is a call or a kind of reference to ancient Athenian democracy and the central role of the agora as a place for public deliberation, for debate, where citizens could make themselves heard. I'm well aware of the limitations of Athenian democracy. I'm also even aware that the picture that is shown here is not the actual Athenian agora. It is, however, in my opinion, a nice visualization of what I'm talking about. The key argument is, of course, not that we need a literal Athens Commission. I think it would be a good idea. That's just an illustration, a provocative point. The key argument is that, to the extent that the EU is responding to democratic backsliding in the wake of a rise of populism in Central and Eastern Europe. It is overly looking at rule of law deterioration, whereas there are other trends going on that deserve more of our attention. We are in a time when it is possible to do real-time monitoring of public debate. That's because much of it is going on online, either through digitalization of parliamentary archives or in social media. It is possible to monitor this, to design algorithms that allocate measures of quality to the ongoing debate. And that is something that I think we should explore in order to safeguard these kind of informal norms that support the formal institutions of democracy. And that this ultimately should also be linked to EU decision-making and the distribution of EU funds. Let's pay a little bit more attention to the way we talk with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter de Wilde, for this indeed provoking idea. Perhaps an idea that we will come back in the comments and questions. But let me just highlight that indeed you point out to a very critical element of democracy, deliberation. As you say, the way how we talk to each other, the way how citizens engage with each other, with their politicians. In arguments over political choices, and that this deliberation is showing a critical decline. Let's talk perhaps about the relationship to the rule of law and to which degree the two hang together a little bit later in the discussion. I would like to pass on, so to speak, the floor to our next panelist, indeed, with some additional findings from our RECONNECT research, which is currently going on the question of populism and to which degree populism is advancing and why and how to respond to it. Alvaro Oleard from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Thank you very much, Kolja. Pleasure to be in this panel. So in my intervention, I'll try to complement a little bit Ben's initial intervention, essentially by outlining how populism can revive democracy in the EU. But I would also like to make the link to Peter's presentation, as I think that there is there's a close connection between how populism can revive and renew democracy and the quality of deliberation. So I would start by saying that populism has become, and during the last decade, as a buzzword in elite circles to define political opponents in many ways. And this idea that populism is a threat to democracy has become, in many ways, mainstream. And indeed, populism has, as Ben has outlined, an anti-elitist and anti-establishment nature, but at the same time, it's not necessarily anti-pluralist, or at least it depends on the context in which we'll look at it. So in my case, for instance, I'm looking at the case of Podemos in Spain, which is a party that was created in 2014 ahead of the European elections, precisely. And indeed, during the first moments of its creation, Podemos had a discourse on challenging the constitution of Spain that was born after the Francoist dictatorship fell down in 1978. However, this harsh discourse towards the political elite in Spain progressively shifted towards becoming a more traditional center-left discourse that was mainly threatening to the Socialist Party, the center-left established party. And ultimately, in January 2020, this ended in actually a joint coalition in which the Socialist Party offered a coalition with Podemos, and currently now they are in a government that one can hardly argue that it is in any way a threat a threat to democracy. And I think this is a good example that can also remind us of previous events, and one of that comes to my mind is the case of Syriza when it came to power in 2014, and the mainstream framing was populism is confronting Europe. And while indeed Syriza was a populist party, at the same time they were also offering a political alternative that was not there previously. So in that way, I would argue that they were not threatening European democracy, but instead were enlarging or renewing the political alternatives that were present at the time. And in the previous panel, I think Sylvia Kritzinger has talked about how the European project has moved from a permissive consensus in which citizens accept the European project without necessarily being involved, towards a constraining dissensus, in which the rise of Euroscepticism and populism makes more difficult to advance European integration. And I would argue that what we perhaps need for the future is an empowering dissensus. So given the rise of interest in European politics, I think that the rise of many of these so-called populist parties like Podemos in Spain, but not only, also Syriza previously, in some ways can enrich the European debate by bringing to the fore and to the public sphere political options that were not there, expanding the quality of public deliberation precisely by expanding the possible alternatives, as deliberation is not only about how we can civilly discuss between each other, but also about recognizing that there are fundamental positions that are not only different but also fundamentally opposed to each other. And in a way, politics and a democratic politics should be about navigating these oppositions that exist in society and reaching some compromise. So in some ways, populism, I think that can be a renewal element towards European democracy. And maybe I would just finish with a reference to the conference on the future of Europe that was also discussed in the previous panel. And I think that there is a temptation by European institutions to make the conference on the future of Europe in some ways a mechanism by which established actors, mostly based in Brussels, discuss among each other to come out with possible solutions to improve European democracy. And I would say that it should not be yet another Brussels bubble mechanism, but in fact try to encourage citizen participation and embrace the contestation of some European policies. Even when it is uncomfortable, democracy is also based on conflict, is also based on the criticism that European citizens can have towards European institutions, and this can in fact lead towards enriching European democracy rather than hindering it. So I think I would stop it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alvaro, for these very interesting reflections. And I particularly liked your reflection on the question of, well, you know, the empowering dissensus, and to which degree this empowering dissensus would be a new way potentially of thinking about how to engage also with those who we perhaps do not necessarily would like to embrace in the first place, but out of necessity to think about reforming a system that is critically affected and that is also showing weaknesses at this moment. We can come back to this again in the discussion, but I think it's very well taken, the point that you've made. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to our last intervention, the intervention by Rosa Balfour, Director of Carnegie Europe. Most of you probably know Rosa also for her writing and assessment of European foreign policy, but she has lately also commented quite extensively on the need to actually think about change in Europe and how that change in Europe can actually not only empower the European Union at home, but also externally. Rosa, we are very much looking forward to your comments, and we are very grateful that you could make time to join us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been really interesting, and I agree with a lot of the points that have been made, and so I think we can have a nice sort of, without actually, arranging this, we can actually agree and have some clear messages. So what I'll do, I'll focus on two questions that I've noted. One is, why is it that populism has rattled the EU so badly? And why, in order for the EU to find responses, it really needs to focus on the democratic renewal of politics in Europe more generally, and that by addressing that, the threatening populism can be contained, and it's also the key to saving the EU from crisis, from a risk of descent into irrelevance, etc. But I'd like to premise one point which. Which perhaps hasn't come out quite yet in the discussion so far. I think that populism is a consequence of the democratic decline. It's not just a cause of further democratic decline. So it's not that, because populist parties have emerged, Europe or European democracies are under threat. It's actually the decline of democracy, and I'm very much in line with Peter Mayer's analysis, and he dates this really from the 1980s, when mainstream political parties started to lose their role as a linkage between society and the executive. And he starts stating this back to the 1980s, and it's that decline that caused the void. That's what how Peter Mayer calls it, and in that void new actors could step in, and some of these new actors are deliberately anti-democratic. They claim to be democratic, but they have a very majoritarian view of democracy, and they're anti-pluralist, so ultimately they become non-democratic. Jan-Bert Muller calls them proto-authoritarian, which I think is very good definition. Not all of them have become, and we've mentioned Podemos has been mentioned more than once, and I would also perhaps include Syriza. They have socialized into the system, and they haven't threatened the constitutional prerogatives of democracy. But all the others, that is the evolution they've taken, and I think Fidesz is the most extreme example of this. And at this point in time, I think it's irrelevant to describe Fidesz as populist. It's authoritarian, but its origins were, and its evolution and its methods were populist. So in looking at it from this point of view, populism is born as a national phenomenon, and we've seen, we've been living with it for at least 30 years, and I know Italy very well, so that's the 1990s, but I think Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands have also been living with populism for some time at the national level. But it's only in the past decades that we've seen this having an impact on EU politics and on EU ability to move forward on its policy platform. So I think it's worth asking why that is. So the first obvious answer is that the EU is a very easy enemy, right? And this, I think, is embraced by populist parties from the left and from the right. So from the left, it's the technocrats, the elites, the IMF-driven bureaucrats in Brussels, and for the right, it's actually pretty similar. So I don't think we need to elaborate so much more on this particular point, this particular imagery that populism has pursued. But we also saw at the same time, for a number of complicated reasons, the end of permissive consensus. And this is due to globalization, it's due to Europeanization, it's due to the fact that decisions, and this is part of the democratic problem, decisions that affect citizens very closely are actually taken quite far away. Brussels, Washington, etc. And that's part of the sort of big trend that's part of globalization. But then we also saw with the Lisbon Treaty that despite the fact that the Lisbon Treaty expanded the powers of the Parliament, but it also made decision-making much more intergovernmental. And so the decisions were concentrated very much, not only at the level of the Council of the EU, but very much at the level of the heads of states and government. And because this past decade was a crisis-driven decade, all sorts of decisions from the economy to foreign policy to migration were actually concentrated in the hands of the heads of states and government. So we had this concentration, which meant that the relationship back to the electorate was very much in the hands of heads of states and government. Heads of states and government with an eye, of course, on managing the crisis, also on an eye on keeping their coalition politics, also with an eye on being elected and for the being confirmed in power, but also with great power to mediate messages from Brussels to the domestic audience, which very easily became, the blame game. And we all know the blame game, don't need to say much more about it. So in a way, the EU became a kind of playground for this type of politics. And when you have populist leaders emerging, holding other EU allies to ransom because they have a specific domestic priority they need to pursue, and then you see that actually these leaders are successful in managing to persuade the other 25, 26 member states to follow their line. Well, suddenly that becomes a tactic that you might want to use. And we've seen in the midst of the last decade, we saw plenty of supposedly non-populist leaders copying the populist methods because they were successful, because traditional politics was not able to find solutions, to find that the response, find that balance. I think it was Ben Crum who mentioned it, that balance between embracing populism and ostracizing them. They didn't find that balance. They weren't able to engage with these movements. They weren't able to find answers to these movements. And so it became a very successful method. And after 10 years of this, I think it's becoming very dangerous. The dynamics in the European Council are becoming extremely dangerous, and they're undermining EU capacity to act on a whole range of issues, including foreign policy, but I'll keep that out for today. But I see that dynamic playing very negatively on foreign policy. So to answer the first question, why has populism rattled the EU so badly? It's easy to project that enemy, impose this dichotomy of technocracy versus nationalism, the real identity, the end of the permissive consensus, and these dynamics in the playground of the EU in this past decade of crisis. But the problem, the origin of the problem, is at national level. It's not necessarily at the EU level. And I think that's where it's been very difficult for the EU to find the appropriate answers. First, in the past, the traditional mechanism was, let's do institutional reform to address the democratic deficit. But de facto, even if the European Parliament, well, we can have a conversation about the performance of the European Parliament, but I would say that even if it's managed to stem the sort of, downwards participation rate in elections, but only just, half the Europeans go to vote. It hasn't really provided an answer to the democratic deficit question. So then the EU has started to focus more on policy performance, right? So the argument is populism is caused either by fear of loss of identity or by economic inequalities. Let's deliver on policies and then everything will be all right. And I think this still is a very dominant line of thinking. It's very much the line of thinking, when the EU started to, try to address the coronavirus pandemic. First few weeks were a disaster, then suddenly tried to get its act together and say, we are delivering this, we are delivering that. So it's very much about policy performance. which means that the EU as a whole is missing the source of problem. The source of the problem is that democracies are in trouble. It's not that the EU is in trouble. The consequence of the fact that democracies are in trouble are felt very much at the EU level, which means that member states may not feel the need to think about democratic reform in their own countries, and they just think about policy performance at the EU level. So here, to conclude and to move towards some of the things that have been said earlier, especially, on deliberative democracy and conference on the future of Europe. For me, the key really is to make that reconnection between politics. And I would include, and I think the coronavirus pandemic shows that it's even more important, I would very much include the local level, because that's where you can have substantive and meaningful deliberations and consultations with citizens. And that's where you can deliver those things that, citizens have felt missing, services, services, health, schools, a good quality of life, etc. So I really think the key is to look at democracy across these disjointed levels, because so far they've been disjointed. And these levels need to include the local, the national, and the European Union. And in my view, however paradoxical, because I have been saying, the problem is in the member states, it's not the EU. The EU suffers the consequences, but it's not the source of the problem. But I do think there is an opportunity for the EU to do it precisely because it's not a state, precisely because it has this multi-level governance approach to things, precisely because it has subsidiarity, the concept of subsidiarity. And it can connect, I think, better these levels, which are, I think, the essential levels that need to be looked at if one wants to rethink democracy. Just one last sentence on the future of Europe, not on the conference, just on the future of Europe. Moving forward, and we've been through these strange months with the pandemic, and now the economic forecasts are a bit less confident that we might be heading into a long-term recession. We'll see, but there is going to be an economic recession. Economic measures are being put forward. I really think there are three areas the EU needs to focus on. One is the economic recovery and try to, through that, address the inequalities of the Eurozone, basically, Eurozone governance. Number two is democracy, and what is happening in Poland and Hungary, I think, is very serious. And number three is foreign policy. And these three are all interconnected. And if you look at the quality of democratic deliberation, quality of democratic life in Europe, if you look at through those lens, you can see that these three issues can be addressed differently from how they're being addressed now.
Thank you very much, Rosabel, for these comments and reflections. In fact, also highlighting at the end the interconnectedness on the one hand, the question of democracy on the level of the member states that has an impact for EU institutions, something that I think Dan Kiliman also calls the other democratic deficit of the European Union. And at the same time, the interrelationship of the effects in various policy fields, the economy, democracy, foreign policy, and the problem for the EU basically to find solutions in each of them without necessarily undermining the other. So we are obviously dealing here with a very complex situation, and I'm very happy that we already have a couple of questions now from the audience. We have one question from Kim Chapelet from Princeton University, who is asking, and I will read the question out loud because it's a relatively long one. When the EU is accused of a democratic deficit, one counter argument is that the EU is built on the democracies of the member states. But if some member states have such comprised democratic governments, Hungary now a competitive authoritarian regime, then what does this do to democracy at the EU level? How can the still robust democracies within the EU shield themselves from the compromised regime? Hint, isn't this what Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union was made for? Why, therefore, are the good member states so reluctant to criticize their anti-democratic colleagues? I think this is a question that every one of you should try to answer, because it's actually tapping into a lot that you have been saying, both democracy on the EU level, but also democracy and democracy challengers on the level of the member states and the reaction to them. I also have a second question which I would like to point out, and that is mainly a question for Peter de Wilde by Sina Özdinmir. Apologies in advance. She says, if I have misunderstood what you meant by deliberative quality, but my question is, if we were to surveil the public discourse to ensure a healthy level deliberation, how would we balance this intervention for the sake of deliberative quality with core norms of liberal democracy, such as freedom of speech and tolerance? Secondly, how could this intervention for deliberative quality turn the already antagonistic debates back into agonistic debates? Finally, we have a question from Alfredo Rizzo, who says, I'm a little bit surprised that there are no Italians on this panel. Italy has indeed something to say on populism in Europe, at least since the 90s in the last century, after the Clean Hands investigation, which caused the fall of Craxi and the Democratic Christian Party and allowed the rise of Berlusconi as one of the major actors in the European political arena. And this went on till the beginning of the current concluding decade. In the end, populist parties in Italy, including the Five Stars, Lega Nord, and so forth, have been on the rise. Do you think current populist parties, mainly on the opposite now in Italy, could succeed in the struggle against the current Italian government, which is currently discussing in the European Council for the restart of the economic situation in Europe? A long question, but I think very important to also get the context right. I would like to pass on these questions to each of you. Perhaps you can pick one or two aspects of each of these questions. And I would suggest that we start with Ben Crum again, and then go on with Peter de Wilde, Alvaro, and Rosa.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just briefly first respond to the final question about Italy. There should have been an Italian, of course, on this panel. That's completely correct. But there's only so many nationalities you can accommodate, I guess. I think Italy is a fascinating case. I mean, I've lived in Italy and I've never understood it. But it's also, I think, a fascinating case in how remarkably resilient it is. So it lives by its own rules. There is always a bounce back. There are many ambiguities. So I think many of us would have predicted Italian democracy to go in deep decline earlier on. You've certainly lost, of course, the old parties to a large extent already in the 1990s. That left a void. In that sense, the void in Italy preceded many voids, like the one we have now in France. But somehow there are always a rebalancing in Italy. And one thing is, of course, indeed, I think the Lega here is the main threat. But the Lega still is, I think, despite your opinion, remains an ambiguous party. It's also a party that's unlikely to control the whole of the country. That's as much as I can say about it. But I'm not pessimistic about Italy. I'm always amazed by the improvisational and resilient qualities of Italian society, even if it doesn't operate by Dutch rules. But we should not impose Dutch rules on everything. I want to turn then to Kim Scheppeler's question and start from indeed underlying that you can only have a strong European democracy if you have strong national democracies. And we know that European democracy is imperfect, deficient, and still a work in progress. And I think it's I feel it's really very difficult now to start to talk about the future of Europe and democratizing Europe, indeed, if you have member states that are simply democratically compromised. So if you don't have, I mean, what kind of party is it on the table? So that's one. And I think there's a further complication why I love this debate on the future of Europe, but I think this is a very bad moment in that respect as well, is that you not only need strong national democracies, you also need democratic relations between the member states. That means that you have to speak on the basis of some kind of equality. And I feel that the situation that in which Greece has been for the last 10 years, but also potentially the situation where, for instance, Italy may be in these next years, may really involve a relation of economic dependency or dominance and compromise the ability to really engage in a full democratic conversation. So we really have to work on those two things first. Now, turning, of course, focusing then on Hungary. Well, there's of course several explanations why the EU has not effectively operated against Hungary so far, but mostly I would say they come down to political will. And I would say that, well, in my most optimistic scenarios, and we keep hoping, of course, that the EU will get its act together, but in the most optimistic scenarios, we may have two factors coming up that may make it possible that something will be done on Hungary. And one is, of course, that the Polish election. I'm still hopeful that Trzaskowski can win, and that would mean a change in president in Poland. And of course, I mean, we always needed this 26 member states consensus to sanction the 27th. And if the Polish-Hungarian tandem breaks down because the Polish people recapture their democratic rights, then that, of course, brings one important condition into place where action becomes possible. The other one is, of course, that you need a political entrepreneur also at the level of the member states. So the Commission, of course, has been making a lot of movements on both Poland and Hungary, but member states have been very silent. Who knows that the German presidency, well, it could make a difference if Merkel and her government are really willing to take the lead on this and recognize that this is crucial for any future of the European Union, and then they might do. And there are some signs actually that the German presidency is willing to put this issue very high on the agenda and to take it seriously. So if those two stars align, change of politics in Poland, and indeed an entrepreneurial and autonomous lead of Germany on this dossier, then we may be, well, those are really my bets that we might get some serious movement here, and that this really big stain on European democracy can be addressed.
Thank you very much, Ben. Peter.
Thanks. Thanks to the audience for the questions. I'd like to address the question by Kim Scheppele on why the good leaders don't do anything, and the question by Sina Özdemir on how far do we engage in monitoring, and where's the threat to democracy there. So on intervention from good governments. I'd say the explanation is twofold. It's about elections and it's about priorities. It's about elections in the sense that they don't get punished domestically at home by their voters if they don't intervene. This is simply not amongst the key issues that voters care about. Particularly in Germany, we've seen that CDU-CSU can just continue to support Orban without domestic electoral penalty. Secondly, it's about priorities in the sense that governments push their own policy priorities in EU Council, and they have to set priorities if they want to achieve their aims. Now I'm thinking, for example, about the Dutch government in EU budget negotiations has a clear priority of limiting spending and thereby its own net contribution, and pushing that so hard that it doesn't really care anymore, or well, it does, but it doesn't allow it to emphasize what the actual money that is in the budget is spent on. it puts all its political capital on reducing the amount of money, not leaving anything for what is spent on. This is particularly strange because you could envision a scenario where these good governments do not so much focus on the democracy and the liberalism criteria and argue that we don't want to fund member states where the rule of law is not respected, but instead frame it in a sense that would speak also to more basically their constituencies and also voters that would be inclined to vote populist and say, we're not going to fund these kleptocrats. Why do we send our tax money to people that just cipher it off to their cronies? That would be a much better electoral argument, not in the sense of respecting the principles of democracy, but in the sense of convincing voters to tie electoral consequences to the continued existence and profiteering of these not so good governments. Then on the question of monitoring, when I argue that we need to monitor the quality of deliberation, I am particularly not arguing for censorship, so not deleting or blocking any arguments that do not meet basic criteria. And I'm also not arguing in favor of grading or evaluating policy arguments. I think Alvaro made a very strong point that we need a kind of dissensus. That's part of democracy. We should not go after disagreements over key legitimate policy questions, whether it is European integration, EU membership, migration, gay marriage, abortion. These are all very sensitive issues where I think we can have a good quality democratic debate voicing both sides of these conflicts. I'm talking about basic civility. I'm talking about ad hominem attacks. I'm talking about calls for violence and hatred and these kinds of violations of key elements of deliberation. I think there the EU would, is legitimate to say something of an equivalent of a mute function, right? If you can't voice your arguments respecting basic civility, then, well, frankly, we're not really interested in listening for a while. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter, and on to Alvaro.
Thanks, Kolja. Well, maybe I would just like to touch upon the first question, as the second has already been replied, and I think Rosa is better equipped to address the Italian question. What I would say is that in the EU, that there is a power struggle between EU institutions, and the traditional driver of European integration has been the Council, has been national governments that have made deals in order to advance integration. Now, what is happening now, and I think that this is particularly interesting in the case of the Corona crisis, in which many national governments have been active in different member states. So Pedro Sánchez has published several articles in The Guardian, in Le Monde. Von der Leyen has also traveled across different national media. And this cross-national media engagement is interesting, but at the same time, I think it indicates what Peter has written about what is called the discursive intergovernmentalism, in which governments make more salient EU issues, but still this salience is driven by national governments, which also I think pose a certain normative question. So what I would say is that there's currently a situation in which there is a transnational flow of ideas, and we have seen it with the rise of the Me Too movement that doesn't stop at the border, or currently with Black Lives Matter. But there is a mismatch between the transnationalization of debates and ideas and the transnationalization of institutions. And in this context, the EU, I think, finds itself in a very difficult situation to address the breach of rule of law and democracy in Hungary, because most of its member states indeed don't want to touch upon some of its peers. And I would just maybe finish by saying that the need for transnational collaboration is greater than ever, considering the pandemic, but also climate change and other issues. And it requires as well a different institutional structure. The current one is not well equipped to address these issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. And before I go on to give Rosa the floor, I should also mention that Carl Wright wrote in the questions to the panel that he was very intrigued by the comment by Rosa on the importance of local democracy and supports this, as he can observe in his own case as working in the Canterbury Climate Action Partnership in the UK. And he points out that actually what mayors are doing in the context of the COVID-19 crisis is very important to bring together stakeholders, local stakeholders, around issues which are of key dominance and importance, I should say, for the new Commission and the next years to come, such as climate change, new Green Deal, but also the fight against the economic recession, which unavoidably will happen in Europe. Rosa, your time.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So what has happened, just to follow up on this comment, what has happened locally, these forms of collaboration to address the corona crisis, you could imagine them as sort of best practices or models for reinventing how we work on democracy together, especially if it reverses the austerity that has hit local authorities pretty much everywhere for the past 10 years at least. So I think that's a really interesting point, and I'd hope that research focused a little bit on this, because we need to find those best examples. We need to find where it works, and obviously when you're talking about 500 million citizens and a plurality of municipalities, it's really important to have some empirical research. So a few points. Alvaro made some interesting comments I wanted to follow up on, but I think I got distracted by the other comment on okay, I'll take it from here. So next week, the EU leaders will meet in person to discuss this recovery fund, right? And it's true, it has this it ought to address three, well, shall we say, first, the post-coronavirus response. Secondly, this north-south problem, or call it whatever you want. Let's just call it north-south. It's not correct, but problem about the frugal four seeing the south as spendthrift and not deserving grants, and then it has the rule of law question. If the EU wants to do anything meaningful to counter backsliding democracies, it really needs to tie some conditions in the money that it disperses to these countries, because as things stand now, according to the Financial Times this morning, Hungary, Poland, etc., are the ones that are going to actually benefit the most from the recovery fund, as it is with in this current state of negotiation. Then let me make another point about the Netherlands, although I shouldn't be making it because I've never really focused on the Netherlands very much, but I will nonetheless. I think this very narrow tunnel view against, it's very much a stigmatization of the European South that Rutte is pursuing, is very much a consequence of populism in the Netherlands. Because although the Netherlands has managed to keep the populist parties out of government, it has shifted the mainstream very much closely to, I think, a lot of the populist arguments. Therefore, the Netherlands, which supposedly is a country that supports democracy and human rights globally, is actually not seeing the consequences of, it's focusing on Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, whatever it sees as the spendthrift South, versus looking at the rule of law question in Central Europe, which I think is hugely disappointing. But if I add to that there were polls quite recently about the amount, how much citizens in Europe believed in disinformation, the Netherlands came very high up. So it seems to me that the decades of populism have actually undermined the resilience of civil society and of the media, and that it looks like Dutch people, according to this poll, are believing disinformation about coronavirus. This was very latest point. Then I'll just say something about Italy, although Ben said, you know, I agree very much that it's quite striking how Italy manages to, I'm half Italian, right? It's quite striking how Italy manages to bounce back. And I agree, that is actually a very interesting question. I haven't found an answer to it. But Italy has been through, it's had the sort of Berlusconi Forza Italia populism, very personalistic, a bit like Trump, but very liberal in economic terms, which Trump isn't. Then it has the Northern League, etc., chauvinists, far-right version. It has the Five-Star Movement, which you can't really class anywhere. Now it has sort of post-fascist right, which is also emerging and being described as populist. So it's really experimented all of these. I think it's a pioneering case in Europe. Everybody should look at Italy. But where it's going to go, I don't know, because what we've seen after 3 decades of populism is a hugely volatile electorate. So I really don't know how this has evolved. Of course, there's a risk. Of course, if Merkel, Macron, etc., don't play their cards well, there will be an impact in Italy, and there is a risk that, you know, if the government falls, there are new elections, the far right will win. That's extremely likely. But at the same time, the electorate is very volatile, so I'm not willing to make predictions. I mean, this government was doomed to last 1 month, 2 months, and it's still there, right? So it's very difficult at this point in time to predict. That's it. Oh no, just one closing final remark from me. I think it's important for the EU to be much more proactive in countering democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland, not just because of Hungary and Poland, not just because it needs to be a democracy to have, it needs to rest on national democracies to have its own legitimacy, but because Hungary and Poland have become destabilizing factors for the EU, and they have a very different view of how Europe should evolve. And it's an intergovernmental view, and it's a loosely integrated Europe, which I think is simply not the right type of Europe that we need in the future.
Thank you very much, Rosa Balfour, for your last comments and responses to the questions from the audience. Our time is unfortunately already up again. We are over time. But like in the first panel, we are doing fine. It's only 15 minutes, which means that wherever you are in this world, you can either now go and have dinner if you're in Asia, you can have a nice breakfast if you are in the US, or you can go for lunch if you are in Europe and Europe's time zone. So I don't want to be the last word, though. The last word is perhaps also a thanking word for all your very useful comments, for really comments that are, I think, critical to the debate, that also show the, so to speak, progressive dynamics in our RECONNECT project. And I'm very much looking forward to the next rounds of debates in the years to come, which will, of course, have to answer some critical questions. What is the fine line between, so to speak, working together with populist parties on the one hand, and when do we recognize populist parties as authoritarian, so to speak, parties, or even bringing in dynamics which are overcoming the democratic system itself? How to draw, so to speak, the red line, and how will systems be able to recognize this? But also the question that arises from Peter's talk, which is basically, well, who is to be blamed, and how can we fix it, right? That deliberation is on such a sharp decline. Do we have to perhaps also have to blame the long permissive consensus in the European Union, a neoliberal, perhaps, permissive consensus, which made citizens forget about the need to engage actually in policies because they were ready-made or seemed to be ready-made. But this is just one reflection, and the question is, so to speak, how can we actually make deliberation big again? Alvaro, similarly, your point on, of course, the point, well, what to do now, right? How can we critically engage with diversity? Perhaps it's finally time to actually take diversity, unity and diversity, really by the name, right? Engage in difference and not just claim that there is diversity, but also show that difference matters, and that we have to actually, as Peter also said, we have to engage in difference in any democratic system. And for Rosa, a last comment, of course, is, and I'm so surprised that we haven't mentioned Brexit once in this panel, but okay, that's fine. Here it comes. Perhaps all of what we are saying and seeing, the so-called frugal four, perhaps this is, on the one hand, yes, they are under pressure domestically, but perhaps they are just exploiting the new political post-Brexit order, and they claim, so to speak, to be recognized in that post-Brexit order much more provocately than they did before. So here we go, 15 minutes late. Thank you so much to all of you, Ben Crum, Peter de Wilde, Alvaro, and Rosa Belfort. Thank you so much. Please, however, tune back in at 1:30 when the Vice President of the European Commission is talking about the conference on the future of Europe, as well as for the panels, the highly interesting panels on the rule of law and the COVID-19 situation in the European Union. Thank you very much.